The first thing I remember is the way everyone at the table froze, their forks lifted halfway to their mouths, as my daughter pulled her boyfriend toward me with a smile that already carried mockery. The Mother's Day decorations behind her glowed softly, casting warm light across her face as she introduced me with a tone that felt rehearsed and cruel. "This is the failure of our family," she said, as if she were presenting a joke rather than her own mother. My other children laughed immediately, their voices overlapping with that familiar, careless amusement they used whenever I became the subject of ridicule. I didn't rise from my seat or attempt to correct her. I simply remained still, as I had always done whenever these moments surfaced. But her boyfriend, the celebrated CEO she had bragged about for months, did not join them. He studied each of their faces, then looked directly at me before speaking in a calm, steady voice that cut through the room. "Interesting," he said. "Because she's not the one who's done." If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. That was the moment something subtle but undeniable shifted in the atmosphere around us. My name is Ruth Adeyemi, and for as long as I can remember, I have lived at the margins of my own home. I learned early in motherhood how to move quietly, how to prepare meals without drawing attention, how to sit in the dim corners of rooms so others could occupy the center, and how to make myself small enough not to disturb the image my family preferred to project. Throughout the years, gatherings often felt like scripted performances where everyone else had defined roles while mine remained silent and invisible. My daughter Kemi always sat in the brightest place at the table, receiving the first servings of food, the loudest praise, and the most indulgent attention. I received whatever remained, small acknowledgments, reluctant thanks, and moments that felt like leftovers of affection. I rarely complained because complaining only invited more criticism, reminders that Kemi needed more support, more opportunities, more understanding. Somehow, I became the person expected to shrink so she could shine. But that Mother's Day dinner marked the first time someone at that table broke the pattern, and it made me realize that the script I had silently accepted for years was finally beginning to unravel. Long before that Mother's Day humiliation, the pattern in my home had been shaped quietly, almost invisibly, by small moments that accumulated over the years. Each moment seemed insignificant on its own, but together they built the foundation of the way my children learned to see me, as someone whose needs came last, whose voice mattered least, and whose presence blended into the background unless they needed something. Even when they were young, it was clear which of them was allowed to take up space and which of us was expected to surrender it. Kemi always claimed the brightest corner of every room. She had a bold personality, a quick smile, and a way of demanding attention without ever looking demanding. I loved her, but she learned early that favoritism served her well. If she misplaced her belongings, it was my fault for not reminding her. If she failed a test, it was because I didn't push her enough. And if she succeeded, the credit belonged to her effort alone. I was simply the quiet support behind the scenes, necessary but invisible. My other children followed that example in subtle ways. They learned to side with their sister because it was easier. They witnessed how I responded to unfairness with silence, and silence taught them that I would always absorb the blow without retaliation. Even on days when I accomplished something small for myself, finishing a course I enrolled in, waking early to complete extra work, or setting aside savings, they had a way of dismissing it as though it held no real value. There were brief moments when I convinced myself things would change. I told myself that as they grew older, they would mature and understand the sacrifices I made. I believed that motherhood was an investment that would eventually return warmth. But those hopes dimmed gradually, the same way a candle burns down unnoticed until only a stub remains. The truth is, the erosion of respect doesn't happen in loud scenes. It happens slowly, in quiet corners, through repeated omissions and unchallenged cruelties. And by the time Mother's Day arrived, that erosion had already shaped everything that unfolded at the table. One of the earliest moments that revealed the true hierarchy in my home happened on an ordinary afternoon that should have passed without incident. Kemi had forgotten an important school project, an elaborate poster she had insisted on making the night before. I remember helping her gather the markers and papers, watching her take pictures for social media while I cleaned the mess she left behind. The next morning, she walked out without the project, completely unaware that she had left it on the dining table. When the school called asking about the missing assignment, the blame did not fall on her. Instead, my second son walked into the living room holding the phone out to me, and before I could even greet the teacher, Kemi stormed in, outraged and dramatic, insisting I should have reminded her. My children watched quietly as if the fault truly belonged to me. No one questioned why a mother should be responsible for carrying the mental load of everyone's obligations, even when they were fully capable teenagers. Moments like that repeated themselves so often that I started to lose track of which accusations were genuine and which ones were simply convenient. I was the default explanation for anything that went wrong. If they argued, it was because I didn't teach them better. If the house felt tense, it was because I didn't manage things properly. Slowly, those comments built a narrative around me, a version of myself that was incompetent, unimportant, and ultimately disposable. It wasn't always spoken aloud. Sometimes it appeared in the silence after I shared good news or in the way they changed the subject the moment I opened my mouth. Their indifference carried its own weight. I grew so accustomed to being overshadowed that I rarely noticed when my own desires began slipping out of focus. There were days I tried to push back, to remind them that I was more than a background character in their lives, but every attempt was met with rolled eyes or dismissive tones that implied I was overreacting. Looking back now, I see how these small, painful patterns created the perfect environment for the humiliation that would eventually unfold on Mother's Day, as if the moment had been rehearsed over years without my noticing. As the years unfolded, the imbalance in our household became so familiar that I no longer recognized it as something unusual. It simply became the rhythm of our lives. Whenever Kemi desired something, the whole family seemed to rearrange itself around her needs. If she wanted new clothes, we found the money. If she wanted to attend a special event, everyone adjusted their plans. Meanwhile, anything meant for me always seemed to be postponed, reallocated, or quietly forgotten. I remember the first time I allowed myself to dream of doing something for myself. A friend had shown me a flyer for a weekend business workshop, explaining how it was designed to help women start small ventures from home. I brought it to the table one evening, hopeful that maybe, just once, my children would support my interest. Before I could finish the first sentence, Kemi chimed in that she needed funds for a school trip. Her siblings agreed immediately, insisting her opportunity was more important. By the time the conversation ended, my workshop had disappeared behind her request, and no one even noticed how quietly I folded the flyer and placed it in the drawer. Moments like that didn't break me all at once. They chipped away slowly, the way a river wears down stone. I told myself that mothers make sacrifices and that patience was part of the job. I reassured myself that unconditional love meant giving even when nothing came in return. But in truth, I had begun disappearing into the roles they created for me. The caretaker. The cook. The cleaner. The financial safety net. Everything except a woman with her own voice and aspirations. And yet, even as I faded into the background, a small part of me still hoped that one day they would look up and realize how much of myself I had poured into each of them. I believed they would eventually see the difference between devotion and dependence. But the older they grew, the more clearly they showed me that they had no intention of understanding the sacrifices I made. By the time Mother's Day arrived, all those years of quiet dismissal had already prepared the perfect setting for what unfolded at that table, an environment where disrespect felt normal and compassion felt optional. There was a day, years before the Mother's Day incident, when I finally allowed myself to recognize how far the imbalance had gone. It happened on an evening that should have been ordinary, the kind that usually passed unnoticed. I had finished cleaning the kitchen after everyone left their plates on the table, and I was sitting alone for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. It was rare for me to stop long enough to hear myself think. My life had become a series of tasks, constantly moving from one responsibility to another. Kemi barged into the room with the same confidence she carried everywhere, announcing that she needed money for a last-minute event her friends were attending. When I reminded her that I had already contributed to her expenses earlier that week, she barely listened. Instead, she called for her siblings and told them loudly that I was being difficult again, as though my refusal to submit instantly was an inconvenience rather than a boundary. Her brothers appeared almost immediately, not to ask questions, but to echo her frustration. They insisted that I was overreacting and told me that Kemi shouldn't miss opportunities because of me. The way they spoke made it sound as if her desires held more value than my exhaustion, as if my weariness was an exaggeration instead of the natural result of carrying a household almost entirely on my own. I remember looking at them, my grown children who had once held my hands when they were small, and realizing that somewhere along the line, respect had been replaced with expectation. They didn't see me as a woman with limits. They saw me as a resource they had the right to drain without question. I handed Kemi the money that night, not because I agreed with them, but because I didn't have the strength to handle another argument. As she walked away laughing with her brothers, I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel before, an echo of resentment forming quietly beneath the surface. I didn't know it then, but that small moment became part of the long road that led to the Mother's Day table, where all the quiet wounds I had collected would finally stop staying silent. There was a period when I genuinely believed that if I simply worked harder, loved more, sacrificed more, endured more, I would eventually earn a different kind of relationship with my children. I held on to that hope for far longer than I should have. It followed me through years of overlooked birthdays, ignored achievements, and moments where my efforts were dismissed as basic obligations. Yet the moment that finally strained that hope beyond repair came not from an argument, but from a quiet realization. It happened at the end of a long workday. I had picked up extra shifts to help cover household needs, believing I was doing the responsible thing for our family. When I returned home late in the evening, exhausted and carrying groceries, I found my children gathered in the living room. They were laughing loudly, sharing food I hadn't known they ordered, and discussing plans for a weekend trip I hadn't been told about. Their excitement filled the room, but it stopped the moment they noticed me standing in the doorway. Kemi glanced at the grocery bags in my hands and frowned as though I had disrupted something important. "Mum, we already ate," she said casually, waving a hand toward a pile of empty containers. "You didn't need to bring anything." No one asked how work went. No one offered to help unpack the bags. They simply continued their conversation, stepping around me as if I were part of the furniture rather than the person who kept the house running. I placed the groceries away in silence, listening to them laugh in the other room, their voices rising over the hum of the microwave reheating leftovers they hadn't cared to share. When they finally left for the night, I sat alone at the dining table surrounded by the muted echoes of their joy, realizing that I had built a life where I was always included in the labor but rarely included in the warmth. It was in that quiet moment, with the house still smelling of food I didn't taste, that I understood how deeply they had learned to live without considering me. And without knowing it, they were preparing themselves for the moment on Mother's Day when their cruelty would finally return to them in a way they never expected. There came a point when the quiet neglect at home began spilling into other areas of my life, revealing just how deeply my children's attitudes had shaped the way others treated me. One particular moment stands out, a moment that made me realize just how invisible I had become, not only in my own household but in the world around me. I had been working at my job for years, never missing a shift, never raising my voice, always completing tasks with diligence. My supervisors often described me as dependable, but never as skilled or accomplished, as though reliability was the only quality they believed I possessed. One afternoon, during a meeting, I offered a suggestion for improving one of our workflows. It was an idea I had spent weeks thinking about, hoping it would bring some value to the team. The room fell silent. Several colleagues exchanged glances, and then someone moved on to the next topic without acknowledging what I said. Minutes later, another employee repeated the exact same suggestion, almost word for word, and the room lit up with praise as if he had presented something groundbreaking. I sat there, hands folded, listening to the approval he received while my own contribution slipped away unnoticed. I shouldn't have been surprised. At home, my efforts had always been overshadowed or claimed by someone else, and somewhere along the way, I unconsciously carried that same posture, quiet, accommodating, easily dismissed, into the outside world. The realization settled heavily in my chest as I walked home that evening. I kept thinking about how often I had minimized myself, how often I had allowed others to speak over me, and how rarely I had insisted on being heard. When I reached the house, the lights were on, and I could hear my children laughing in the living room. For a moment, I stood on the porch, feeling the weight of every unspoken thought I had been holding for years. I wondered what it would take for them to see me, not as the background character they had grown accustomed to, but as a woman who had carried this family through storms they never noticed. I didn't know it then, but the answer would come on Mother's Day, when the truth would be laid bare in front of everyone. As the months passed, the distance between my children and me widened in ways that were subtle enough to dismiss at first, yet persistent enough to become impossible to ignore. I had always assumed that once they reached adulthood, the dynamic would shift, that they would begin to understand the weight I carried, the sacrifices I made, and the quiet strength it took to raise them alone. Instead, the older they became, the more boldly they leaned into the entitlement they had grown up with, as if maturity had amplified their disregard rather than soften it. There was a particular evening that revealed this truth with painful clarity. I had spent the entire day preparing a meal I hoped would bring everyone together, a simple attempt to create the kind of warmth I continued to crave, even after years of being overlooked. The aroma filled the house, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine an evening where we would sit, share stories, and reconnect. But when my children arrived, they barely acknowledged the effort. Kemi walked in scrolling through her phone, announcing she would not be staying long because she had plans with friends. My sons followed behind her, arguing about something trivial and noisily grabbing plates before I even invited them to sit. The meal I had prepared with such care became nothing more than a backdrop to their conversations about people and places I knew nothing about, conversations where I had no space to participate. When they finished eating, they drifted out of the house as casually as they had entered, leaving their plates on the table without a word of thanks. The silence that followed their departure pressed heavily against me, settling into the corners of a home that had once been filled with childish laughter. I sat alone at the table, looking at the empty chairs, realizing that my presence no longer shaped the rhythm of their lives. I was a place to visit, not a person to cherish. That night, as I washed the dishes they left behind, I understood something I had been avoiding for years. Love without respect is a quiet kind of abandonment, one that wears down the spirit long before the heart breaks. And though I didn't know it yet, that understanding would become the foundation of the resolve I carried into Mother's Day, the day everything changed. There was a morning, not long before Mother's Day, when everything I had been tolerating finally settled into a truth I could no longer ignore. It began with something as simple as a missing payment. I had set aside a small amount from my monthly earnings, money I intended to use for a health checkup I had been postponing for months. I placed the envelope in the back of a drawer, tucked neatly beneath my scarves. When I opened the drawer that day, the envelope was gone. At first, I thought I had misplaced it. I searched the drawer twice, then the closet, then every logical place I could have stored it. Eventually, I walked into the living room and asked my children if any of them had seen it. The silence that followed told me everything before their faces did. My oldest son avoided eye contact. My second son pretended to be confused. Kemi simply sighed, annoyed at being interrupted. Finally, my oldest son admitted he had taken the money. He claimed he needed it to cover an emergency, though the new shoes by the door suggested otherwise. What hurt wasn't just the theft, it was the casualness in his voice, the entitlement in his posture, the belief that my hard-earned savings were simply available for him to use without permission. When I expressed my frustration, he dismissed me with a shrug, saying, "Mum, you always find a way. It's not that serious." Not that serious. The words struck deeper than I expected. They echoed every moment when my efforts were taken for granted, every time my needs were pushed aside in favor of theirs, every instance when silence felt safer than confrontation. And as I looked at them, my children who were old enough to know better, I realized they no longer saw me as a person with boundaries. They saw me as an unlimited resource, someone who had no right to say no. That afternoon, when they left the house without offering a single apology, something inside me shifted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I was simply tired of being treated as invisible, tired of carrying the weight alone, tired of pretending that their neglect was normal. And without realizing it, that quiet exhaustion prepared me for the moment on Mother's Day when the truth would finally surface in front of everyone. A few days before Mother's Day, something happened at work that mirrored the same quiet dismissals I had been enduring at home. It was the moment that made me realize the problem was no longer confined to my family. It had followed me into every space I entered, shaping how others perceived me. I had spent weeks preparing a detailed report for our department, a project I completed with care after staying late on several evenings. It wasn't extraordinary, but it was thorough, thoughtful, and something I was genuinely proud of. On the morning of the presentation, I arrived early to set up. The report was stored on the shared drive, neatly labeled and ready to go. But when the meeting began and the manager opened the folder, the file displayed was not mine. Instead, it bore the name of a colleague who had barely contributed to the discussions. As he confidently presented the project, I recognized the formatting, the structure, even phrases I had drafted word for word. My work had been taken, polished with slight adjustments, and claimed as someone else's achievement. I sat quietly, the way I always had, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. No one questioned the sudden expertise of the colleague presenting. No one asked why I looked startled. And when the manager praised him for stepping up and showing real initiative, I felt the same invisible shrinking I had grown used to at home. After the meeting, he approached me casually and said, "I figured you wouldn't mind. You're not really the type who likes attention." The assumption landed heavily. It wasn't that I didn't like attention, it was that I had been conditioned to expect none. I walked home that evening with a strange mix of numbness and clarity. For years, I had allowed people to overlook me because I believed silence was the safest choice. But now I understood something important: silence had not protected me. It had erased me. That realization stayed with me as Mother's Day approached, settling like a quiet determination in the back of my mind. I didn't know how the day would unfold, but I knew one thing: something inside me was no longer willing to be invisible. The night before Mother's Day was unusually quiet, almost as if the house itself sensed the tension that had been gathering over the past weeks. I moved through the room slowly, tidying up out of habit rather than necessity, letting my thoughts drift in and out like distant waves. For years, I had told myself that motherhood required endurance, that sacrificing my comfort was simply part of loving my children. But as I stood in that dimly lit living room, folding blankets no one thanked me for, I felt a strange clarity settling over me, a quiet awareness that something in me had shifted permanently. I sat down at the edge of the couch, the same spot where I had listened to countless arguments, apologies, and demands, always ready to fix whatever was broken. But this time I wasn't thinking about what needed to be fixed. I was thinking about what needed to be acknowledged. I thought of the envelope that had been stolen, the dinners they rushed through without gratitude, the long nights I spent hoping they would someday see me with kinder eyes. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to admit that I was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could cure, but the kind that settles into the spirit after years of giving without receiving. I realized that I had grown used to carrying the weight of everyone's needs, believing it was selfish to consider my own. Yet the more I tried to hold the family together, the more they drifted away from me, not out of rebellion, but out of habit. They had grown comfortable with my silence. As I looked around the quiet room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of separation, a distance that was no longer painful but necessary. I didn't know what would happen at the Mother's Day dinner, but I understood one thing clearly: I no longer had the strength to protect their comfort at the cost of my dignity. I went to bed that night not expecting a confrontation, but knowing that whatever happened the next day would change something in me, perhaps even in them. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of that change. Mother's Day arrived with a quiet heaviness that clung to the morning air. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple outfit, not to impress anyone, but to feel steady in my own skin. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed the faint lines near my eyes, the subtle signs of years spent trying to hold together a family that had learned to overlook me. For the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of those marks. They were evidence of endurance, of a life lived with patience, even when patience was never returned. When I arrived at the house, the celebration was already in motion. Laughter spilled from the dining room, plates clattered, and the scent of roasted food filled the air. No one greeted me when I walked in, they barely noticed my presence. My children darted around the room, arranging decorations and passing drinks as though I were part of the furniture they had grown accustomed to ignoring. Kemi, dressed elegantly and glowing with confidence, was standing near the table with her boyfriend, tall, composed, and quiet, just as he had been the last time I saw him. She spotted me and immediately beckoned him forward with that familiar smile, the one she wore whenever she was preparing to say something that would place her above someone else. I recognized the gleam in her eyes. It was the same expression she used when she introduced her achievements, her purchases, her successes. Except this time, she was introducing me. She pulled him closer and, with a tone as light as it was cruel, said, "This is my mother, the failure of our family." The room fell into a brief, uncomfortable silence before a few of my other children laughed, as though humiliating me was an expected part of the celebration. I felt the sting of their words, but I didn't flinch. I had lived through harsher moments of neglect. What surprised me wasn't their reaction, it was his. Kemi's boyfriend did not laugh. He watched her, then looked around the room, then finally settled his gaze on me with a steady expression I couldn't read. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm enough to quiet the entire table. "Interesting," he said slowly. "Because she's not the one who's done." And in that moment, before anyone understood what he meant, I felt something shift in the room, something subtle, powerful, and long overdue. For a moment, the room stood completely still, as if everyone had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Kemi's smile faltered, her confidence slipping in the space between his words. My other children exchanged confused glances, unsure how to interpret the sudden change in his tone. They had expected laughter, perhaps even agreement, not the quiet authority that now hung over the table. He stepped slightly away from her, not dramatically, but with enough emphasis to make it clear that he no longer intended to play along with the scene she had created. His gaze moved slowly around the room, lingering on each of my children as though he were seeing them for the first time. Then he looked back at me, directly, steadily, without hesitation, and something in his expression made my breath catch. For the first time in years, someone in that house looked at me without dismissal. Kemi let out a strained laugh, trying to regain control. "Babe, relax. My mom knows I'm joking. She's used to this. It's just, family banter." Her voice trembled at the edges, revealing a crack in her confidence she couldn't hide. He didn't respond to her explanation. Instead, he turned slightly toward the table, his posture straightening as though preparing to reveal something that weighed on him. The room quieted even further. Even the clinking of cutlery stopped. He took a slow breath before speaking again. "You call it banter," he said evenly, "but what I've seen is a pattern of disrespect. And after what I learned recently, I can't ignore it." My children shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between one another. They were accustomed to controlling the narrative, not being confronted with it. Kemi frowned, confusion tightening her features. "What exactly are you talking about?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone, unlocking it with a calmness that seemed to amplify the tension in the room. When he tapped on a folder and held the screen for a moment, a few of my children leaned forward nervously. At that point, I didn't know what he intended to reveal. But the quiet certainty in his voice told me one thing clearly: whatever was about to unfold would finally challenge the version of me my children had built and believed in for far too long. And for the first time, I felt the possibility that truth, my truth, was finally preparing to speak. Kemi's boyfriend held his phone in his hand for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch across the dining room. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of shame yet, but the unfamiliar silence of anticipation, something my children were not used to feeling. They were accustomed to steering conversations, controlling the tone, and deciding who deserved attention. But in that moment, they were simply waiting, uncertain and uneasy. Finally, he looked up from the screen and met Kemi's eyes. "Before I say anything," he began calmly, "I need you to understand that what I found didn't come from a single moment. It came from a pattern, one I didn't want to believe until I saw it clearly. Kemi stiffened, her smile disappearing completely. What pattern? What are you even talking about? She asked, her voice sharper than before. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of scrutiny. He turned the phone toward her first, showing her something I couldn't see from where I sat. Her face drained of color. Her fingers twitched as if she wanted to snatch the phone away, but she forced herself to remain still. My other children shifted nervously, watching her with growing anxiety, sensing that whatever he had discovered was not something easily dismissed. Then he stepped toward the large smart TV mounted on the wall. I didn't plan to do this today, he said evenly, but after the way you've been speaking about your mother, I think this conversation can't wait. My heart thudded in my chest. I didn't know whether I should brace myself or breathe easier. I had been ignored for so long that the idea of someone defending me felt foreign, almost frightening. He connected his phone to the TV with one tap. The screen brightened instantly, washing the room in a cool glow. A folder appeared titled Truth. He opened it without hesitation. The first file displayed wasn't a photo, but a screenshot of a message thread, Kemi's messages to him. Lines of text filled the screen, complaints about me, exaggerated stories, excuses, and subtle lies that painted me as a burden or an embarrassment. Messages she had sent behind my back, believing I would never know. My children gasped quietly. Kemi's eyes widened, then narrowed. Why are you showing that? She demanded. He didn't look at her. Because this is where it begins, he replied. This is the version of your mother you've been selling to me. And it didn't match the woman I observed. For the first time in years, the truth didn't whisper in hidden corners, it stepped into the light. The room remained painfully quiet as the messages lingered on the large TV screen. Each sentence revealed a version of me that was twisted, exaggerated, or completely fabricated. Small complaints turned into insults, simple misunderstandings reshaped into narratives of incompetence, and private moments distorted to make me look foolish. Seeing those words displayed so boldly made my chest tighten, not with anger, but with a deep, familiar ache. It was the kind of ache that comes from realizing someone you love has rewritten you into a character you barely recognize. Kemi stood frozen beside the table, her eyes darting between the screen and her boyfriend. Those messages were private, she said sharply, her voice shaking. You had no right to show them. He finally turned to her, his expression calm but unwavering. Private or not, you used these messages to justify the way you treat your mother, he replied. You told me she was irresponsible, dramatic, impossible to rely on. You made me believe she was a burden. But every time I've seen her, she has been the opposite. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. You're misunderstanding, those were just frustrations. Everyone vents. Venting is one thing, he said. But what you've done is different. You made cruelty sound normal. You turned disrespect into routine. My other children shifted uncomfortably, unable to hide their guilt. They weren't innocent either. Even if their words weren't displayed on the screen, they recognized themselves in the tone of Kemi's messages, dismissive, entitled, and careless. Kemi tried to speak again, but he continued, what shocked me wasn't the messages themselves. It was how consistent they were with the way you and your siblings behaved in front of me. He tapped the screen, and it changed to a second file, another screenshot. This time, it was a series of bank transfers. Money I had saved. Money I had given. Money they had taken without asking. Gasps rippled around the room. Kemi stepped backward as if distancing herself from the evidence. Why are you doing this? She whispered. He looked at her with quiet disappointment. Because today, you humiliated the one person in this house who has given you everything. And you did it with pride. For the first time, my children looked at me, not as the background figure they were used to ignoring, but as someone they had wronged. The truth was no longer something they could pretend not to see. The room felt colder as the second screenshot lingered on the TV, rows of bank transfers, withdrawals, and unexplained transactions. Each line represented something I had sacrificed, something I had worked for, something I had quietly given up while convincing myself that motherhood meant never asking questions. Seeing it all displayed together made the years of loss feel painfully visible. My children stared at the numbers with growing discomfort, realizing for the first time how much they had taken without ever thinking of the cost. Kemi stepped forward, her voice strained. Those transfers weren't wrong. Mom always helps us. She knows we need support. She never said anything. She didn't say anything because she trusted you, her boyfriend interrupted gently but firmly. Not because she agreed. His tone cut through the last bit of confidence she had been holding on to. You used her silence as permission. My second son looked down at the floor, his jaw tightening. My oldest rubbed his hands together nervously, as if trying to erase the guilt rising in him. None of them had expected their choices to be uncovered so plainly. For years, they treated my sacrifices like an endless supply, something they could rely on without gratitude. Kemi opened her mouth again, but her voice came out softer, almost defeated. You're making it sound worse than it is. He shook his head. I'm not making it sound like anything. I'm showing you what happened. Then he tapped the screen again, and a third file appeared. This time, it wasn't messages or transfers. It was a short video clip, one I didn't recognize at first. But as it played, my breath caught in my throat. It was a recording from outside my workplace. The footage showed me leaving the building late at night, carrying heavy bags, visibly exhausted. The camera angle shifted to the inside of the office, where a coworker, someone I trusted, was claiming credit for a project I had completed. My voice, my concepts, my work, taken so effortlessly that I had barely registered the betrayal. My children stared, stunned. Kemi's eyes widened, perhaps realizing that the false narrative she told her boyfriend no longer aligned with what he had witnessed for himself. He paused the video and turned toward the table. Your mother has been disrespected at home and at work, he said quietly. But the difference is, I saw it. And I refused to pretend it was normal. The silence that followed was different from every silence before. It was the silence of recognition, heavy, unavoidable, and long overdue. The stillness in the room turned heavy as the paused video lingered on the screen. My children looked unsettled, their expressions shifting between shame and disbelief. For years, they had built a version of me that fit their convenience, someone fragile, someone incompetent, someone who needed to be corrected, dismissed, or laughed at. But the evidence before them showed another picture entirely, a woman who worked hard, endured quietly, and carried responsibilities far heavier than they ever acknowledged. Kemi stood rooted to the spot, her breathing shallow. Why were you recording her? She asked weakly, trying to divert the attention away from the truth. Her boyfriend didn't soften. I wasn't recording her, he replied. I was recording the person who stole her work. She just happened to walk out at the same time. He looked down at the phone in his hand, then back up at the table. And when I saw how tired she looked, it made everything you told me sound wrong. My oldest son finally spoke, his voice low. Mom, why didn't you tell us any of this? His question sounded genuine, but it also carried a quiet guilt, an unspoken admission that he had never made space to hear the answer before. I opened my mouth, unsure whether to explain or to let the moment speak for itself. But before I could respond, her boyfriend stepped in, his tone steady. She didn't tell you because you never asked. And when she tried, you didn't listen. The truth landed with a weight none of them could ignore. He continued, you've all benefited from her sacrifices without acknowledging what it cost her. You've taken her money, her time, her peace, and today, you tried to strip her dignity in front of me. His voice softened, but the firmness remained. That's not something I can overlook. Kemi swallowed hard. Her earlier confidence was completely gone. Are you breaking up with me? Her voice trembled, the question lingering in the air like a crack appearing in glass. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me, as if gathering the strength to speak the truth aloud. Then he turned to her with quiet finality. No, he said. This isn't a breakup. He paused. His next words would shatter the room. He let the silence stretch across the room, allowing every person seated at the Mother's Day table to feel the weight of what was coming. My children watched him with a mix of dread and disbelief. Kemi's hands trembled slightly where they rested against her dress, her earlier bravado completely stripped away. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried the kind of finality that could not be undone. "This isn't a breakup," he repeated slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "This is a termination." Kemi blinked, confused. "Termination? What do you mean?" He took a breath, then spoke plainly. "You're fired, Kemi. Effective immediately." The words hit the room like a cold gust of wind. Kemi staggered back as if someone had struck her, her shock too great to disguise. My other children gasped, their eyes widening. No one had expected him to expose her behavior so publicly, let alone take decisive action. "You can't fire me," Kemi whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm your girlfriend." "No," he corrected her gently but firmly. "You were my employee first. And over the past year, your conduct at work has been irresponsible, unprofessional, and dishonest. I overlooked it because I trusted you. But after what I've seen today, how you treat your mother, how you speak about her, the lies you told me about her character, I can't ignore the pattern anymore." Her face drained of color. "Please, you don't have to do this. Let's talk privately." "There's nothing to discuss privately," he replied. "Accountability doesn't happen behind closed doors." Tears filled her eyes, but he didn't soften. Instead, he turned toward the table, toward my other children, who were now silent and uncomfortable. "All of you should be ashamed," he said. "Your mother deserved better than what you've given her." The room fell into a suffocating silence. I sat there, stunned. Not triumphant. Not vindictive. Just quietly overwhelmed by the sudden shift, by the fact that someone had finally seen me, defended me, and spoken aloud the truth I had carried in silence for years. My children looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in their adult lives. The arrogance drained from their faces, replaced by something unfamiliar, regret. For the first time I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize. I simply breathed, steady and unbroken. Mother's Day hadn't given me flowers, or gifts, or handwritten cards. It gave me something deeper. It gave me my voice back. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.